Okay, this is going to be the first lecture of Unit 2. Unit 2 is going to be covering biological psychology. We're going to get to the different parts of the brain and what happens when our brain isn't functioning correctly. But before we do that, we're going to jump into neurons, which are the building blocks of our brain and specifically our entire body. As a review from the last unit, remember there are different types of psychology. This unit, we're going to be covering biological psychology. This is the branch of psychology that's concerned with how our brain affects our behavior, how our brain affects our personality, and what happens when parts of our brain are damaged. What does that mean for our behavior, for our personality, and for our future? Biological psychology can take on many different forms. If you wanted to have a career in this field of study, you could be a behavioral neuroscientist. So you could actually be someone who goes to medical school and operates on the brain. You could be a behavior geneticist. So you're looking at how our genes, that branch of evolutionary psychology, how our genes affect our behavior. You could also be a physiological psychologist. You're looking at different parts of the brain, or a biopsychologist. Again, they're all concerned with how our biology is affecting our behavior. The body is made up of a ton of cells that talk to one another. And that's what biological psychologists are concerned with. What happens when those cells talk to each other? What happens when they don't? Now, before we had the technology to study the brain that we do today, the early ideas about the brain came from something called phrenology. This is where people would feel your skull and feel the bumps on your skull. And they truly believed that the bumps on your skull would reveal abilities and traits about someone and be able to explain their behavior. Now we have technology such as fMRIs, CAT scans, MRIs that can look at the brain and tell us exactly what's going on. It's important that you realize that everything that is psychological is simultaneously biological. Everything that happens in our mind is controlled by our biology, and everything that happens within our biology is controlled by the mind. So going back to those early philosophers' ideas, are the mind and the body connected? Biological psychologists say yes, they are connected, and they have so much influence on one another. Before we get into neurons, we need to talk about the nervous system. Neurons are within the nervous system, but you also have different parts. This should be kind of a review from biology if you've taken that. Two parts of the nervous system. You have the central nervous system, which includes the brain and the spinal cord. And then you have the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system breaks down into two branches, the autonomic branch and the somatic branch. The autonomic branch of the peripheral nervous system controls self-regulated actions like internal organs and glands. So our stomach pumping and being able to function, our hormones being able to function correctly and having the endocrine system release those hormones through glands. That's the autonomic branch. The autonomic branch breaks down into two more branches, and these are the most important part of the peripheral nervous system, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. The sympathetic peripheral nervous system arouses us. Think that you're walking down a dark alley late at night and you hear a noise. Your sympathetic nervous system is going to arouse you, is going to alert you and say, hey, look, there is a potential threat. You heard a noise. Pause, look around, see if someone's after you, and if so, run. The parasympathetic nervous system is going to calm you down. So once you hear that noise, you're like, oh my gosh, someone's after me. You pause, you look around, and then you see a rat scurrying off. The parasympathetic nervous system is going to calm your body back down. We're going to get into these two branches of the peripheral nervous system a little later on, but it is extremely important. The somatic peripheral nervous system controls voluntary movements of skeletal muscles. So purposely raising your hand to ask a question in class, that's going to be controlled by your somatic peripheral nervous system. And then another part of the nervous system is the endocrine system, which actually isn't part of the nervous system. It's its own system completely. The nervous system releases neurons and neurotransmitters, whereas the endocrine system releases hormones. Your hormones are controlled by two kind of glands. One is adrenal glands. These release hormones such as epinephrine and norepinephrine, which we'll talk about later on in the lecture. But the master gland behind your endocrine system is the pituitary gland. This is regulated by part of the brain called the hypothalamus, and it controls growth. If you have pituitary gland problems, your growth could be stunted. The endocrine system is really responsible mostly for the regulation of hormones, whereas the nervous system is really responsible for neurons and the neurotransmitters that they release, which is what today's lecture is going to be on. So neurons are the chemical messages of our life. They are the building block of our neural system. There are about 100 billion neurons, which are nerve cells in the human brain. And what makes these different neurons unique is their shape and their function. Some of the neurons are devoted only to motor functions of our muscles. Some are devoted only to sensory neurons, so our senses. And what makes them unique is their shape and how they function. The structure of a neuron is extremely important to understand how neurons fire. At the base of the neuron, you have the cell body, or the soma. This is what contains the nucleus. You then have dendrites. Dendrites receive and carry information from one neuron to the other, whereas an axon is what carries the information to the next cell. So if axons are the ones that are speaking, they are relaying the information, and dendrites are the ones that are listening. The myelin sheath insulates the axon and speeds up the neural impulses. The myelin sheath helps to protect the neuron, and it also helps to send those chemical messages that we know to be neurotransmitters very quickly. So if you look at a diagram of a neuron, you've got the cell body, or the soma, in the middle. The axon is this long, thin, tube-like structure that is passing the messages from one neuron to the other. So the axon is speaking. It's sending the message. Where the dendrites are these finger-like projections that are receiving the messages. So they're taking the message from one neuron and carrying the message into its own neuron. Now, as far as neurons go, most of the time, neurons are resting. They are not transmitting information. You see is a subsection, a cross-section, I should say, of a neuron here. When the neuron is not firing, you have negative ions inside the neuron, and these positive ions are outside the neuron. This is when the neuron is just hanging out, not firing, not moving. There's no message that's being sent. Is known as this resting potential. It's the action potential that sends a message from one neuron to the other. So with an action potential, it's this sudden massive charge in the neuron. What happens is those positively charged ions go from outside the neuron to inside the neuron, and you can see them switching here in this cross section. So when a neuron fires, positively charged ions go inside the neuron and then back out, and inside the neuron and back out. When a neuron fires, this is what we know to be as depolarization. What this means is that the neuron has been stimulated enough to where the message can be sent from one neuron to the other. The neuron has been stimulated so much that it's reached its threshold of excitation. And once a neuron reaches its threshold, it says, okay, I'm good, I'm fully charged, I can now send the message on from myself to another neuron. Now, after a neuron fires, it needs a period of time where it chills out, it relaxes. This is what we know to be the refractory period. Once a neuron fires, it goes through this depolarization process again, where it has to reach its threshold before it can fire for a second time. Now, this happens really quickly, but for a small period of time, the refractory period of a neuron is when it's just chilling out, the negative ions are inside the neuron, the positive ions are outside the neuron, and then once the threshold of the neuron has been reached again, they make that switch. A neuron either fires or it doesn't fire. This is known as the all or nothing principle. A neuron never sort of fires. It either has reached its threshold and will fire, or it has not reached its threshold. It's either going through the action potential where it's firing the message, or it's going through that resting potential where it's not firing. The intensity of a stimulus is seen by the frequency of action potential. So the more intense a stimulus, the more quickly that neuron is going to reach its threshold and go through the refractory period again. Now, the different types of neurons that we said, you've got sensory neurons, which carry information from sensory systems to the brain. These are known as afferent neurons, whereas motor neurons are carrying information from the brain to the muscles and the glands. They often go through body tissues. Interneurons, we have billions of interneurons that carry information between sensory and motor neurons. Now, neurons don't touch one another. There's a gap in between these neurons, and this is called the synapse. The synapse is a junction between the axon of the sending neuron and the dendrite of the receiving neuron. This is often referred to as the synaptic gap or the synaptic cleft. There is so much activity that goes on in these synapses. There's so much important information that happens in the synapse. For example, if you are depressed and you're taking an antidepressant drug, that message, though that activity is happening in the synapse. If you happen to be addicted to cocaine or crack, all of that information is happening within the synapse, and we'll get into that a little later. I now want to show you an animated video of a neuron firing. I'm going to play it once, and then we're going to start a new lecture, and I'll explain to you what it is that you're seeing. Alright, so I'm going to play it again. I'm going to leave the explanation of the last bit of the video off until we talk about neurotransmitters. So here you see chemical messages are being fired. These are neurons that you're looking at. The little electrical charge is the neuron reaching its action potential. Here you've got the positively charged ions and the negatively charged ions going in and outside of the neuron. This is the action potential. There they go. Refractory period, action potential. Chilling out, refractory period, action potential. When the positively charged ions go inside the neuron, the message is being sent.